this informal Aula public forum, for lack of a better name. Let me call us all to order. My name is Dana Hall, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Owasco Watershed Lake Association. And my replacement come June is on also, and that's Ann Robeson. So tonight, I'd like to welcome on behalf of Aula and everyone attending, Darby Kiley, who is with Tompkins County, as you probably know, the Department of Planning and Sustainability. And Darby, by way of introduction, I'll read the information you provided. I mean, just to get things started here a little bit. So Darby has 2 decades of municipal government experience that ranges from land use planning to water resources protection and to addressing energy and climate change. So obviously a well-versed, well-experienced professional. She has worked for a intermunicipal watershed organization, 3 towns, and Tompkins County, where she currently is an associate planner addressing water quality issues and community planning. Darby, you received your graduate degree in natural resources from Cornell, and an undergraduate degree, I guess, with a major in chemistry, or anyway, with emphasis in chemistry and environmental science, both from Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania. So, Darby, I will turn the meeting over to you in just a moment. I presume you would like to do your presentation, and we'll ask you questions. We'll ask you questions after you get done.
Yeah, it's always tricky to keep track of the chat, but if people want to put things in there, we can get to them at the end, or yeah, definitely take questions at the end. It's not a long presentation, and if anyone is on the Cayuga County Water Quality Management Agency, I gave pretty much the same thing about a month ago, so it might not be yet. Rick was there, and that's how I'm here tonight, so you will be seeing some repeats, but happy to answer additional questions based on any materials you see. So with that, okay. I will.
And while you're bringing up your slides, everyone, as you heard Darby, record your questions if you can in the chat box down below. At least it's on the lower part of my screen.
Yeah, and I'm just making some adjustments so I can maximize who I can see here. Yeah, I got plenty of people now. Ooh, I gotta move all these things around. All right, hello, thank you. Appreciate the invite here tonight. And even though I know we're all tired of Zoom, it's also nice to be able to just walk up from the living room and do a presentation and go about our evening. So glad to be here. Glad people are interested in this topic. And I know it's definitely part of your conversations in the Owasco Lake watershed. So I'll just start with, okay, getting the slides advanced. Just a quick agenda. We'll cover what the stream buffer benefits are and a variety of different widths based on goals that might be, or goals or objectives of a watershed or a municipality, and then tie in stream buffers with state and county recommendations, and you'll see what documents I pull from, and then give examples of 2, but then I'll talk about another municipality that just approved some stream setback regulations very recently. So I'm going to say stream buffer, stream setback, riparian buffer, kind of interchangeably. So that's just kind of my the various terms I may use. And what we're talking about with a stream buffer are these vegetated areas on either side of a stream. And I'm mostly focusing on streams, but often you can refer to a riparian buffer also along the lakeside. So those are often called riparian buffers as well. So might refer to it as that. And that's just any this vegetated area that protects and buffers the water body, our streams and our watershed from the impacts of human activities. And I just pulled a couple examples of from a DEC document of a healthy looking riparian buffer and one that's not so much, where it's just paved and then some lawn that's maybe not as helpful in trying to buffer the water body from human activity. So the importance, it's good to think about, like, why do we know that stream buffers are important, and how can we improve them? And so the kind of the four areas that we look at are the habitat and biodiversity. So both terrestrial and aquatic animals are reliant on these areas for their habitat, for travel corridors, food, and those types of things. For just we see a lot of beaver activity or deer that we might see along our riparian buffers. And then another important aspect of a stream buffer is for stream stability. So these areas are places where floodwaters can rise and settle out, and then the vegetation itself, the root system helps stabilize the stream banks and preventing erosion. Another important aspect is just the water quality protection that they provide in terms of removing pollutants, and whether that's the overland surface runoff. So you might be able to capture sediments in a stream buffer area, but then below ground, there's the work that the roots are doing. And yeah, actually my master's degree was on root side or stream side vegetation and a lot of below ground biomass. So I get really into the water quality pollutant removal aspect of the stream side vegetation. And then that can also help the vegetation trees help moderate the stream temperatures especially for fish and other aquatic life. And then we also include stream savings as important benefit of stream buffers. And in that, we're talking about protecting properties from flooding, and then other, just the property values and protecting investments that might be along a water body. And then the question always comes up, what's the ideal width of a stream buffer? And it really depends on the objective. And this is an older slide from even the late 90s from EPA in the Chesapeake Bay, but there's more research coming out all the time on like what are the important widths depending on what your goals are. So smallest, narrowest width of a buffer, you're looking at your stream stabilization and providing food for the aquatic food web, and then all the way up to much wider, like 300-foot wide buffers. That's important for wildlife habitat, and then everything in between: water temperature, nutrient removal, sediment control, all those important things were mentioned. And then it also depends on, flood control is going to be different, whether it's a flat area or a steep slope. And so you really have to keep in mind, what are your goals? What is your land use and the landscape of an area in terms of what might be the ideal buffer width even in particular locations. It might vary across the landscape. So I brought up there are some state recommendations, and I pulled these out because we turn to some of these state documents, and the one is that HAB's action plan, and both the Cayuga Lake one and the Owasco Lake had very similar recommendations. These came out in 2018. And one of the priority one projects, these are things that were supposed to be implemented in years 1 to 3, which are now, of course, already passed, is establishing vegetated riparian buffers. So that's like one of the most important priority projects that the HAB's action plan recognizes. And then another one being rehabilitating degraded riparian buffers. And this one's points specifically to the Cayuga Lake, but I think there's a very similar one for Owasco Lake as well. So that's an important plan that the state provided. And then and for Cayuga Lake watershed, we have the total maximum daily load for total phosphorus for Cayuga Lake came out in April of last year. And if you go through the list of all the best management practices that are listed in that document, the one there are the several that come up as the best management practices, the BMPs, that have the highest amount of phosphorus reduction with the lowest cost to install, all revolve around riparian buffers or herbaceous buffers. And then it points to especially those where there's pasture land and exclusion fencing. But those riparian buffer recommendations for BMPs for installing those and putting those in, especially on agricultural land, will give you the best bang for your buck in phosphorus reduction. So, we're looking to see when the DEC comes out with the final TMDL, and I'm not quite sure what the timeline is on that, but see like what BMPs, if they kind of stay similar to what was in the original draft. And then I just wanted to share a few resources on the Tompkins County Department of Planning and Sustainability website. In 2007, there was a big effort to do work on stream buffers and make some recommendations. As a county, we don't have the land use authority. We can't be passing zoning, but we can help municipalities. And I also see that as a role of our various watershed groups is how can we share information, even just like the lake friendly living program, and that's geared towards the individual homeowner, but we try to help out the municipalities. And so the few documents that were released include the stream buffer planting guide. There's a riparian protection agreement. I don't have much details on that at this point, or just an agreement for if property changes hands, and just you can have this agreement so that it doesn't, you're still protecting the riparian buffer. And the other one that I think we've been using more frequently is the riparian buffer easement. So where we've been using county funds for tree plantings, especially to support the Soil and Water Conservation District or other groups that are doing tree plantings, we require that the homeowner has a riparian buffer easement, and that spells out what they can and cannot do. And that just protects the county's investment. So we, $25,000 here and there goes and it helps do these plantings, and we can protect those. Problem is you have to keep track of it. So there's always a caveat with easements. Some of the other resources we have include a model stream buffer ordinance, and that recommends a 100-foot buffer on perennial streams and a 50-foot buffer on intermittent streams, and talks about 2 zones, and I'll get into that in a minute. And then within this document that I'm showing the cover of here, this enhancing water resources in Tompkins County, it goes through a lot of what I'm talking about tonight. This goes into the details of the benefits of stream buffers, and here I just have a screenshot of the different buffer widths and the benefits, and describing what those benefits would be. So and this document goes into site conditions, recommendations for buffer width, why would when you would use uniform versus variable widths. So that's a good resource. It's a little dated now, but it's all still pretty relevant. And the other thing in the county that we have authority over is we review a number of site plans, subdivisions, and different municipal projects, including comp plans and zoning changes under the New York State General Municipal Law 239 L, M, and N. And so that responsibility comes to our Department of Planning and Sustainability. And so for projects that do have a disturbance within 100 feet of a perennial stream and 50 feet of an intermittent stream, we review the project and its potential impacts. And so as the 2 towns that I'll talk about in town of Ithaca and town of Ulysses, they have established buffer regulations. So we don't say as much there because they're going to need a variance if a project disturbs within their stream setback areas. But in other municipalities, we would make a comment and recommend modification of the project if there's a proposal that does impact that stream buffer area. And so then that requires a supermajority of the board approving the project in order to pass it and not be in violation of that general municipal law. And I know it came up at the Cuyahoga County Water Quality Management Agency meeting asked about the natural features focus areas. That's a project that the county completed in probably a little over 10 years ago, where it recognizes certain areas within the county as having specific and special natural features. And so in those areas, we recommend a larger buffer for projects. So now I'll get into the two municipal examples that I know a little bit about, having worked for both of these municipalities, the town of Ithaca and town of Ulysses. I'll start with the town of Ithaca, is that they adopted their stream, they refer to it as a stream setback law, and that was adopted in 2012. And it is part of their zoning in a special regulations section. And both these municipalities have all their codes on what's called E-code. And so you can just do a Google search on either municipality and find their full zoning regulations in there. And then I'll get into town of Ulysses. They had first included stream setbacks in their zoning change in early 2000s and did a revision just a couple of years ago. And they have it within their zoning in the design standards section. So starting with the town of Ithaca, I'll go through that. They have this stream setback map. So that's what they use to identify the streams and what the requirements are and the different widths that they use, depending on where it is on the map. And we'll see that in a second. And then they really explain both adjustments for steep slopes and wetlands, and then have some good details on the two zones that they consider for protection. And like anything that's in zoning, there's a variance procedure. So if you can't meet the setback requirement, you would go to the Board of Zoning Appeals for a variance. So the stream setback map, I'm hoping you guys can kind of see this. You don't need all the details, but they have 3 different classifications, and they came up with this system based on the drainage area. So the amount of land that drains to a certain point, and then they made 3 different cutoffs. And so then they classify those as being either the 100-foot setback. So those are the biggest drainage areas. A 50-foot setback is the middle range. And then the 35-foot setback is for the smallest watersheds, smallest drainage areas. And so, town of Ithaca we've got the donut that surrounds the city of Ithaca. And you can see the bigger creeks that flow into the south end of Cuyahoga Lake. We have whatever, you guys don't need to know the details of who they all are, but these are the big streams that flow into the south end. And so you can see those red ones are the biggest ones, including like the Cuyahoga Inlet comes up from the south. But then branching off of that are smaller streams. And so you can see how there's that yellowy tan color, and then the green are the smaller watersheds. And then they also include just stream sections that are known to be like within a ditch or culverted, and they don't have a setback requirement, usually because often they're underground, or it's mostly in this northeast portion of the town. Has kind of a lot of the streams kind of get intersected as they go through a subdivision there. So that's their map. And then you have for example, the small setback of the small stream size has a 35-foot setback. Then they say that there's 2 different zones. And then, so next I'll get into what happens in each of those zones. And luckily, this is one of these situations where, pictures and diagrams are worth 1,000 words. It's hard to really understand what they mean by, what do you mean by zone 1, zone 2? And so within their appendix of their zoning, they detail all this information. And so it says that, even I have to lean in to look, but in zone 1, that's the area that's closest to the stream. And so, there's information about don't disturb the area, keep the vegetation as it is. And zone 2 says, no impervious surfaces, but you can do some stuff with the vegetation. And it's important to note that when the town was putting this together, they really went out and looked at a lot of their creeks within their municipality, because they're like, well, what is 20 feet? What is 35 feet? What does this look like on the landscape? And so we're able to evaluate, yeah, it really is important. And there is this direct connection to the creeks in some of these areas where, you really do need to be protecting that amount of land and having that vegetation to meet the water quality and then habitat needs of the area. And then they have more figures that just helps with some of the definitions. So they talk about a bankful depth and width. And so they have that illustration. And then they, as I mentioned, they account for both streamside wetlands and then also if it's on a steep slope. So a lot of, as the streams are coming into the city of Ithaca, they pick up some speed and hit some really big grades. And so they consider the top of the bank, if it's more than a 25% slope, then you measure back from the top of the bank. So that's helpful in trying to apply these regulations. And it's confusing to think about like, oh, what do you do about this and what do you do about that? But really on a site-by-site basis, it's kind of easy to understand. Like, okay, I have this plot of land, I want to do this thing, I have a creek on it, where's my setback and what can I do? And I think in going through the zoning, if you were trying to figure that out, you would have a pretty good understanding about what you could and could not do. And then they really provide details on what's allowed, what's prohibited in each of the zones. So you can take a look at that. If you're applying for a building permit, you would not be able to build it in zone 1 and would need a variance if you were pretty limited. So there's some examples of zone 1. Again, that's the closest to the stream. And then in zone 2 is a little bit more flexible. I mean, again, no impervious surfaces, but if you do mowing or have your garden in that area, that's acceptable. And they also go into a lot of details about agriculture and new agriculture. But if you're familiar with the town of Ithaca, there's not a lot of agriculture. So it's I don't think that has come up as an issue in that area. But it basically is like if you are already having some of your ag practices within the buffer zone, you can continue those, but if you can't start something new within a buffer zone. And then I'll move on to the town of Ulysses, and this is this Taganic Creek and Taganic Falls State Park are in the town of Ulysses. That's for any of you on the further side, you might be familiar with that area. And so they based whereas the town of Ithaca had made up their own stream setback map, the town of Ulysses relies on the USGS topographic maps. And so they have solid blue lines for permanent streams and dotted blue lines for intermittent streams. And that's what they base the setbacks on. So that's, when I was the zoning officer in Ulysses, I physically would grab the paper map and I would look at it and like, okay, it's a blue dotted line. That's in most cases, it's a 50-foot setback. So they do vary depending on the zoning district, except for two of the biggest creeks in the town, which are Taganic and Trumansburg. And then they also, very similar to town of Ithaca, have zones of protection. A wetland setback is also included in theirs, not the streams, but also wetlands. So that's if you want to do watershed or wetland protection, that's one way to get about it, is it included in a similar way as you would streams, and then have a variance process as well. This just wanted to throw in, here's the zoning map. So again, these widths will vary depending on the zoning, and that's Cuga Lake is on the eastern shore of it's the western shore of Cuga Lake is the eastern side of the town of Ulysses. And then here's an idea of probably more streams than would actually be regulated. This is not the USGS topo map, because a lot of these smaller ravines that go straight to the lake are not. I know for certain that they are not part of the setback regulations, although in some ways maybe they should be. But as you guys are probably well aware there's a lot of development along the lakeshore, so it's hard to keep encourage additional setbacks there. So in what their setbacks are, the widths and the zones, as I mentioned that there's just 2 streams that have the 100-foot setback, and then it depends on the zoning district, and it varies between 50 feet and 100 feet for permanent or perennial streams, and then 25 to 100 feet. And the 100 feet is more in the have some of the unique natural areas and steep slopes, so they have the bigger setback. And then it's kind of more of a rough zones compared to the town of Ithaca's, but they just talk about almost like a 3 zone, whereas the closest to the stream would have an undisturbed mature forest, which again is like it's either there or it's not at any point. And then a middle zone that might have actively growing forest, and you could do some thinning, and then an outer zone that could have grasses in it and doesn't necessarily have to be perennial or woody vegetation. So those are the 2 ones that I'd be happy to tell more details of. But then I just wanted to include a couple other resources. One is the town of Danby just last month adopted a riparian buffer overlay zone, and I talked to the planner out there, just connected with him recently, and asked like what were the issues with that, but they did it as part of a much larger zoning update, and so I didn't know if there was a lot of discussion. It sounds like there was not. So this is kind of a recommendation if the municipality is looking to adopt new zoning, make some changes, it could be worth including a stream setback regulation if that's the direction the municipality wants to go. So they did that very recently, never had anything on the books, and they mimicked what the county recommends, which is the 100-foot setback for perennial streams and 50-foot for intermittent. And then they do have some exceptions in their hamlet zone, recognizing that the hamlet of Danby is very established. There's already houses and development right along, close to some of the water bodies. So I don't think it requires as much of a setback. I don't have all the details on that. I forgot to look again before the meeting. And then the village of Trumansburg, also in Tompkins County, has had a stream corridor overlay district in their municipality for several years. It's a very small municipality, and so it really impacts one stream as it flows through the town. So flows through the village, so it doesn't have a lot of implications for much development through there. And just some other good resources include the Department of State has, I forget what this is part of a larger document that they put out, but they do have a wetland and water course protection regulations and models that could be adopted. And Orange County is another one that has a model regulation that folks can take a look at. And let's see, I got this example of a training that we did in Tompkins County in 2019 that if you guys, it's good for municipalities or even just training on your own to learn more about riparian buffers. And it's all on this cooperative extension buffers page. And we recorded all the presentations and had the slides as well. So we had Lydia Brinkley from the Upper Susquehanna Coalition do a riparian buffers 101. Scott Doyle from my office gave a pretty similar presentation than what I just did. And then Kristen Hitchka from the Water Resources Institute talked about watershed planning and different mapping tools. And then we went into, and then Lydia, what else was her? Oh, some project implementation. So Lydia does a really excellent job of talking about what makes stream projects successful and the importance of deer protection on riparian plantings and that kind of thing. And then we had a good case studies and an interactive panel with the group. So again, if you can do these in 20-minute chunks, if you know a group that wants to do some more training or learning on stream buffers. And with that, I'll just wrap up and take questions. Just stop that. Oh, Dana, you're still muted or frozen. Oh,
Darby, Dana, Dana here. Can you see the questions in the chat, or do you need?
yeah,
Okay, go ahead. So,
I'm seeing them now. I don't know, Anne, if you want to just read this, that's a lot to read right now.
Yeah, I was just wondering, in your work in Tompkins County, if there's ever been any policy change to address the fact that these businesses are taking acreage out of production, and how that's been addressed. The other, though, is hearing you talk, at the municipal level within Tompkins County, had you contacted each town about zoning to encourage them to do these overlay districts? Has there been a plan or an approach? I ask because within Cuga County, and I myself within Scipio, the township of Scipio, we just did our zoning. And I wish a year ago I had been privy to your knowledge of all that you share about setback, because we do have a lot of steep ravine. We have different agricultural businesses that have just ripped out any buffer that had been there so that they can get better yield. And just wondering, how do you approach it at the local level?
Yeah, that's a lot going on there.
It's a hard one, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah, and yeah, no, it's tricky. So in terms of the changes in policy, so regulations that like Town of Ithaca and Town of Ulysses have, that's for new construction, and I don't think Ulysses addresses ag practices, and Town of Ithaca definitely does, but basically saying if you're already farming in the stream buffer, then you can continue to do that. So I don't see that as we're not in any way, these zoning regulations do not require you to put buffers back in. I know that's a discussion around the watershed rules and regulations. So we don't, and I guess I try to channel we have countywide assessment here in Tompkins County. And so we have a assessment director. And I think the way he would answer something about property values is if he sees a change in property values based on property sales. So if he saw that like a sale of a property with, a protected riparian buffer would go up or down based on the sale of the property, then he would make adjustments, whether that's devaluing or increasing the value. And so, I mean, it's a hard thing that's where you would see a tax benefit, is if your assessed value goes down because they say, oh, well, this 100-foot buffer is no longer developable. And so it reduces the property value. But I'm kind of guessing we don't see that in sales of, people who have lengthy stream buffers. I don't know if that helps.
That's a good thought, because it makes me leap over to when a township does reassessment. Is that a time to bring this up? And it's just a new thought and a way of human change of how are we stewards. And so anyways, I'm always thinking ahead. So I appreciate what you said. It is a tricky question, many layers to it. I'm also the tax collector, so I can really see this. Okay, so you're just making me think at a different level, and I appreciate it, Darby. It's a very encouraging thing, because we're at this point of what can we do at our local level, or even our watershed, which is three counties. Can't tell you how many townships, but how do we get everybody to take ownership of this, and that we will have to make some difficult decisions and make changes, but our water is such a resource that we have to protect. So you're just you're making me churn a little here, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm guessing, as I don't know how the assessment works as much on the individual town basis, but it seems like real property tax law or somebody gives some advice on how do you handle different land classifications, right? So whether it's forested land or whatever. And so that might be a place for an assessor to look, or, you know, happy to put them in touch with Jay Franklin and the Tompkins County. I'm always offering out his assistance if people need to talk about how you would look at different land classifications. And it's probably harder on the town level to be comparing property values like they can across the county here in Tompkins. So I see, oh, I just lost it. Ann Clark's question about the intermittent streams generally defined. It really depends on, well, yeah, we usually use a stagnant map right now. So like I mentioned, there's a hydrology map from the state that I know some of the towns use, or this USGS map, but you know, and yes, there's totally a definition of you know, how often it's flowing and whether it has a defined channel and that kind of thing. I don't have it on the tip of my tongue right now, Anne, sorry about that. I probably could Google it and find out. All right, Jan probably has a trick question here. Oh, so you asked about the buffer regulations. Let me see if I did include a couple. So in the town of Ithaca, they have, let's see, ag activities that begin after the effective date that the regulations were adopted, or seized for a year or two. So I'm reading, notwithstanding. So that you're permitted to have grazing and haying within the, oh no, that's what's prohibited, is grazing of livestock and then haying, growing crops for commercial use. So those are permitted or prohibited activities. And then applying herbicides, pesticides, and other chemicals within the stream setback area, unless it's approved. Yeah, so that's and that would be for something new that happens after the zoning was adopted, but that was back in 2012. And that's town of Ithaca. Town of Ulysses is very focused on the construction of buildings in terms of the stream setback. I don't know, Jan, did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thanks, Darby.
All right, thanks.
No trick question, sorry.
I know. Well, I never know what kind of zingers you might throw at us here. All right, so then Rick has a question about, oh yeah, roadside ditches. I'm interested that's been a big conversation in Wasco Lake watershed. I don't feel like we've talked about it as much in Tompkins County about buffering the ditches, except that I know our Soil and Water Conservation District has been working with a couple farmers to increase, you know, set back their agricultural practices from a roadside ditch. But if a property, yeah, and it might be, I'd have to look, I wonder if in the town of, so some of those places where, like in the town of Ithaca, where a ditch, a stream becomes a ditch, becomes a stream again, they might have some setback requirements there. So that might be applicable, but I don't think we see that as much in either of those towns. I mean, yeah, there's some, but that's a little trickier to regulate. Again, it's construction of buildings, and that one might be covered in your setback from a road anyway.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I'm assuming Ann Clark, this is a statement.
Well,
Darby?
it is in the sense that it would be wonderful to know if there's anything one can do about that. I mean, there's an overt reduction of vegetation by ditches, so that it would take quite a change, I think, in the practices of ditch installment, maintenance, whatever, to even talk about a roadside, to even talk about a buffer.
Yeah, and David Weinstein is asking about the tile drains through buffer areas, and no, and that's ag practice that no one really has any control over. And there's a concern in a number of places where some of the smaller farms are being bought out by bigger farms, and the first thing it seems like you see is that the new tile drains are put in and connect to the roadside ditches.
Darby, can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
Has there been an attempt to sort of quantify the benefits of these regulations, and if they're actually having a noticeable or a measurable reduction in phosphorus or reduction in nutrients, or any kind of stream bank stabilization assessment that's shown that they've reduced erosion, or any real tangible benefits?
Not that I can think of right now. And I did talk to one of Sue Ritter, who's the director of planning in the town of Ithaca, and asked, how often do you have variance requests? And it's not very often, and usually it's in a spot where there already is a disturbance. Like, there's a couple of the places by Coronel along Cascadilla Creek where the synchrotron is, like, there's already disturbance, and they are asking for stream setback variances there. But yeah, in terms of, we can look through the Community Science Institute data, the water quality data, see if there's any changes. But it's, again, these regulations are not necessarily increasing stream buffers. It's just protecting more development from happening along the stream. So it'd be hard to quantify any changes there, right? Like that'd be tricky.
Well, I mean, even to that end, I mean, have there been an obvious reduction in requests to develop along stream sides, or are you still getting a lot of variance requests? I mean, I don't know how the planning process works, so I'm not sure. But
right. Yeah, and I don't know. I don't think the town of Ithaca has had too many. I mean, I can speak to Ulysses. It was mostly along the lakeshore properties, and that was because they're these tiny little lots already, and they are hemmed in between two gorges. And if you wanted to put a deck out, then you needed a variance. But there weren't that many. I think a lot of people learn the regulations as they're trying to do development and say, okay, how can I stay back from those? And, just the flood risks as well. I mean, we just had the new FEMA floodplain maps came out this week or last week. So I think that'll generate some discussion on increasing stream setbacks, or, some of those regulations. Looking in my neighborhood and seeing where Fall Creek goes by little Malloryville, and like, wow, how are those houses not getting flooded all the time? It's tricky.
well, thanks, Darby. That was an interesting presentation. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I know that Jan is a little bit of a skeptic on some of this stuff, but there are a bunch of studies that have been done, not around here necessarily, but that clearly show that the setbacks do reduce the input into streams, particularly nutrients going into streams. So it's a pretty established science now that we should bank on.
No, I'm not disputing the science, David. I'm just questioning if it's where our effort should be focused. But this isn't the time to have this discussion, so
Okay.
we can carry that on. But no, I agree wholeheartedly. The buffers work, and to me, every stream would be buffered, to the maximum extent possible. But realistically, the politics in town that isn't an achievable goal. So if you have to make decisions on where your efforts should be placed and what type of regulations would have the most impact on reducing those types of inputs to streams, where do we put those efforts up front? And I'm just trying to get to whether buffers are a good investment in the time and energy it takes to implement a good solid buffer protection plan, and whether those benefits wouldn't be better if those energies were placed somewhere else potentially. So that's all I'm trying to get to.
Yeah.
I don't disagree that buffers are valuable at all. So
Yeah, but I think at this point, if a town does not have it in its zoning, there's not a lot of effort that goes into saying, hey, let's not develop any more within 50 or 100 feet of a stream. And I think just for flood protection and so many other reasons, that would be a place to start that doesn't, and then there's the additional, like, how can we establish more buffers? How can we actually get people to do plantings and do other protection? But, just putting it in the zoning shouldn't be a huge lift if your municipality can stomach it. I'm looking at you, Dryden, you guys. Sorry, I'm picking on my home municipality. Since there's three of them I'm looking at.
and then four on the call, at least I know of. So anyway, thanks again, Darby.
Any other questions you guys have?
This is Julie. I'm not going to bother chatting it because it seems more informal than that at this point. Small group. I'm with Aula on the board, and I just wanted to thank all the new faces I'm seeing here. I'm thinking some of you maybe in the Owasco watershed south, and we were always wishing we had better communication with folks who live south of us. I live at the north end of the lake, so thank you for being here. I also wanted to just ask you a little bit about these hard shorelines that you mentioned, that they're an unhealthy border buffer, a wall, for example. And I live on the very northeast tip of Owasco Lake, where Route 38 runs along the lake shore very closely. And there's been a seawall that's probably 8 feet tall, maybe a little higher, along this quarter-mile section that's collapsing. I've lived here 14 years, and we had a really incredible winter about 5 years ago where the ice just showed who was boss and was lifting up these limestone blocks and flinging them around, and nothing has been done to repair any of this. So a tiny bit of it belongs to the county, Emerson Park, the rest of it to homeowners, but I can't imagine they could ever. They didn't put the wall in initially, and I can't imagine they could really afford fixing it. Do you know who has jurisdiction over the kind of thing, or where?
So
how do you think?
It's within the lake. So
It's on the lake shore. It's on the lake shore, yes. And people own the land, but their houses are on the lee side, away from the lake, and then there's a road, and then there's a little more land, maybe about 30 feet with this wall. I also noticed.
that's the Corps of Engineers, they were the ones doing the permitting and something like that.
Yeah, from a regulatory perspective, it would be the Army Corps and the DEC would regulate, because technically it'd be fill in a wetland, so that would be an Army Corps and DEC. But as far as who has responsibility for repairing the wall, that would probably be the landowners, right?
There's sinkholes appearing where there's telephone poles that have been put in, and some pipes, and it's just collapsing and eating very steadily toward the road, within just a few feet of the road.
A thought, Julie, is to foil the town of Owasco to see who put it in when. They could have some records at the town level, who signed off on that project. And as it was mentioned, it could be DEC, it could be Army Corps of Engineer, but find out who originated that project, then go right at them to find out
Yeah.
what.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
And Julie, this is Dana. There's an article in, I believe it's today's Citizen,
Yes.
that says that a special allocation of, I believe, $100,000 has been approved by the local government jurisdiction, as soon as they get the DEC permit, 360 feet of that wall will be, of that collapsed wall will be replaced.
And
repaired.
that's actually on Deauville Island in Emerson Park. I know exactly where it is because I walked by it this past week. So that's a different area, also on the lake, but yeah, and it's not a very big section. And the whole thing's cantilevering out into the lake, and they're gonna take out all that. You know where that big willow tree is in Emerson Park?
Yeah.
That's where that collapse happened.
So Darby, one question for me, if I could. These regulations are not retroactive, you've said. If stream buffers have been removed prior to a zoning ordinance come into place, then what's there is grandfathered in.
Correct, yep.
And then what happens if a business, a farm, whatever kind of a business wants to maximize their field acreage and they remove the buffer, and once the buffer's gone, well, sorry, what, I didn't realize I shouldn't, or whatever the excuse is. Is there any legal recourse that happens to that business owner, or that is just accepted?
Yeah, I'm thinking in the town of Ithaca, I would bet they would enforce their zoning. So they would take action on the landowner if it was shown that they removed the buffer after the zoning was in place. I can imagine the town of Ithaca enforcing that and trying to correct that action. For the town of Ulysses, because it really is tied to building permits, it would be hard to enforce zoning without an action. So if, in the middle of the field, if there's a stream that runs through it and someone takes down the vegetation on either side, having been the zoning officer, it would be really hard to even just show what happened there to enforce the zoning based on that. So that's really hard. Enforcing any zoning is a tricky situation, and especially if it doesn't come with a building permit. So that's a tough one to track down.
Okay, thank you, Darby. Other questions for our guests this evening, anyone? If not, then Darby, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. Your slides are available. Perhaps one of us already has them.
I'll send them to whoever's been emailing me, you and Rick, so I can, and maybe David, I think you're on that email too. I'll PDF that and send it to you.
Good. Thank you, Darby. Thank you very
Thanks
much
for having me.
Thank you again. So
Good.
have a good evening, everyone.